In this video, we're going to learn about feature managers and how that works in GKE Enterprise. In the previous video, we learned about what GKE Enterprise is and what fleets are and how rollout sequencing works. If you have not checked that video out, check that out in the video somewhere here. Links will also be in the description below. My name is Mofi.
I'm Nick, and I'm here to talk to you about Feature Manager, which is going to allow you a central service to enable fleet features onto your fleet using GKE Enterprise. So let's just dive right in. When you come into the Kubernetes engine page in your UI, you're going to see this Fleet Feature Manager section. And when you start to explore it, you'll see that there's a number of features that are in this feature management section that you can start to work out installing on the clusters in your fleet. We're going to start with Policy Manager. We'll talk about what Policy Manager is, but first I'm going to show you how to set it up. So you can come over to the Policy Manager section. It's not enabled on either of the clusters in my fleet. And so what I'll do is I'll click Configure. When you click Configure in Feature Manager, what you're effectively doing is making a change or setting the default fleet config. Once you've moved into setting the fleet default config, you could see that it gives you a lot of information about how to review and set the fleet level settings. I'm actually going to go in here and customize them. So when I hit this customize fleet settings again, I'm setting the fleet default config for policy in this fleet. I'm going to go ahead and turn everything on, right? In Policy Manager, we have a bunch of pre-canned policy bundles that allow you to install policies that check for things like CIS Kubernetes benchmark or PCI DSS if you happen to be dealing with credit card transaction data. So you set these settings, and then once they're set, you hit done. And so now the default for Policy Manager in your fleet, it exists, but you actually haven't pushed it out to any clusters. So we're going to look at those clusters by clicking View Details. And I'm going to decide how I want to sync that change out to my fleet. So one important thing to call out here is that there's a difference between clusters that already exist in your fleet and how you enable fleet features on them, and clusters that are born in the fleet. A cluster that's born in the fleet, meaning a cluster that in the GKE cluster API, you actually name the fleet you want it to join when it's created. That cluster is automatically going to get and receive any default fleet config that you set. So as soon as you add that cluster, that's going to come up to state with all the default fleet features configurations that you set. If it's a member and it already exists, you have to choose to sync that setting. Now we do that because we don't want to break existing clusters. We want to give you a chance to onboard. So what I'm going to do is select both of these clusters, sync to fleet settings. We're being super cautious here. Yes, I want to update these two. Confirm, and that's going to then roll out Policy Controller and the default bundles to both of those clusters, which is my entire fleet.
And these policies in the default mode, the moment I enable this policy, are my application behavior changing, or is this mostly for like monitoring purposes?
Yeah, so Policy Controller at default is set in audit mode. So it's non-intrusive, right? So if you turn all this stuff on, it's actually not going to have any impact on production. So you can enable this on all of the clusters in your fleet without worrying about whether it's going to have impact on those clusters. And then we could spend some time diving into policy where I can show you Policy Manager, where I can show you how you can then use that data to start to get more secure in your fleet. So you can see that it's rolling out that change or that fleet feature to all of the clusters in my fleet. And GKE Prod US Central 101 is set up, and it's still syncing out to the second cluster. And there you go. Now it's enabled across all the clusters in my fleet. So that's generally the flow with Fleet Feature Manager and how you use it to enable features. You set the default config for the feature, and then if the clusters already exist, you roll out that change to your fleet. And again, this can all be done in infrastructure as code. I'm just showing you it in the UI because it's easier to visualize that way. So Mofi, should we take our audience through a quick drive-through of Policy Controller?
Yeah, why not? So we enabled this policy in the cluster that enabled. Should we be able to see any specific like data or dashboard that became enabled because of this?
So Policy Manager is our managed version of Gatekeeper, Open Policy Agent. Now it's installed out to the clusters, and we've set a bunch of default bundles. So if I drill into the policy section, I'll see the status of all of the workloads and clusters that are in my fleet against the bundles that I chose when I set the default config. And again, you can see it's going to give me a view of the status of the installation of OPA in all those clusters. And then I have 0 clusters without violations, which is status quo for how I run things. And then you could even see how many constraints have been set to run in dry run or audit mode, and how many are actually set on an explicit deny. So then you scroll further down and you could see all of the percentage of passing rate per bundle, right? So here's the CIS benchmark. And let's drill into that so we can get a better understanding of what this is actually providing me, right? So the UI then, it allows me to slice and dice by policy and filter violations by policy, but then it also gives me the specific constraint name. So in Gatekeeper, when you're creating a policy, there's a constraint that exists that you're writing that policy against, and this is the name of the constraint. And when I click into it, I'll get an actual YAML, right? So this is the YAML that represents that particular constraint. So this is what's installed in that cluster. And I get details that kind of give me a good explanation of what that particular constraint is there for, right? So this one's for wildcard usage in roles or cluster roles. You have to basically, this constraint is saying you have to be explicit about the permissions you're giving roles and cluster roles, which is a good best practice, by the way. And then I could take a look at the affected resources. So I can see all of the cluster roles and roles that this particular constraint applies to, and the error message that's associated. So this gives me a really good baseline for how I'm doing against a lot of industry standard policies.
If our users wanted to install more policies on top of the ones that are by default enabled, like where would they go to add their own policy or for their own organizations?
Yeah, good question. There's a couple of callouts there, right? One, when you want to start authoring your own policies, you need to just install those policies in the clusters, right? So we have another tool for installing configuration called config sync, but you could use any method that you want to that you already have in place to push out configuration to your clusters. So you would author the policy, push it out to your cluster, and then the Gatekeeper instance that is policy manager that we're managing on your behalf is going to audit against that policy. Same thing goes if you want to move from audit mode to actual enforcement mode. You have to make that change in configuration, push it out. And then the main difference there is instead of telling you what you're doing wrong and asking you to fix it, it's going to prevent you from from installing the thing that's against, or that's breaking the rule.
So with fleets, here we have 2 clusters. So when I go to install the policy, am I installing that in a specific cluster, or there's a dedicated place to install this policy against the fleet itself?
Yeah, I think that'll be a whole topic for our conversation on config sync, but it very much revolves around config delivery and how you're pushing configuration out to your clusters. If you wanted that policy to run on every cluster, you'd have to install it in every cluster. Config sync makes that easy because you can simply set it in a GitHub repo somewhere, and it will magically get installed across all the clusters that are syncing to that repo, which you would probably have all the clusters in your fleet syncing to the same policy repo. So this is great. So I've given you a real quick overview of policy controller and feature manager. So we spent some time diving into policy controller, and now I'm coming back to the feature manager. So we used feature manager to install policy controller, but there are other fleet features, of course, that you might want to look at installing. There's managed service mesh, which is going to give you a managed control plane and a managed service experience for creating Istio compliant service mesh across all of your fleet. Good thing to call out here is if you want to do cross cluster discovery, our managed service mesh automatically sets that up on your behalf. And then we have a whole slew of security tools bundled into security posture that you can install here from Fleet Feature Manager. This is going to give you the capability of getting beyond policy and looking at specific security configurations and seeing how your fleets are performing against these specific security requirements. Like, for example, one of the components will look at the actual application runtimes to ensure that they're patched with the latest CVEs. So that's our build pack scanning. And then also you can look at best practices for Kubernetes config, and we'll make recommendations. So all of that's bundled into security posture. And we'll probably take a whole nother video to dive deeply into that. And then we have config sync. Config sync is great. It's our homegrown GitOps solution. And you can ensure that config sync is installed across all your clusters. What that means is there's an agent that gets installed on every cluster, which actually does the reach out to Git and syncs all of the code that you want into all of those clusters. So you can set that up right here in Feature Manager. And there's some other services below that we're gonna go through and enable in these series, namely multi-cluster ingress, or now multi-cluster gateway, which gives you the ability to set up a load balancer that has multiple clusters as the back end and a single IP as the front end. So you get a single load balancer that can distribute traffic across multiple clusters. So Fleet Feature Manager should make it pretty simple to onboard these features to your fleet. And then we're going to spend the next couple of videos diving further into more of these features and showing how you can then build resilient applications across multiple clusters.
In this video, we learned how to use Feature Manager in GKE Enterprise to enable features across your fleet easily and safely. In the next video, we're going to take a look at GKE Enterprise's multi-tenancy feature called Teams.